It's July 28, 2021, and welcome to the Frontier Center for Public Policy and this edition of Thinker's Corner. My name is David Leese, and I'm your host for today. And Frontier is about better public policy serving all Canadians. We are an independent and nonpartisan policy think tank, and Frontier does not accept any government funding and is entirely funded by an incredible group of donors. Our topic today is about COVID-19, and it's from a unique angle. Our guests will be leading the discussion together about how did Canada respond. Later, we'll ask you for the audience for your questions, so please don't hesitate to share those questions on our chat, and we'll get to them later. In March 2020, most of the world's countries, for the first time in history, locked down their economies and societies in response to the perceived emergency of COVID-19. In Canada's case, instead of following carefully pre-established emergency plans prepared for such pandemics, Canadian elected officials did something very different. Instead of following those prepared emergency plans, Canada's elected officials, particularly premiers and the Prime Minister, handed much of their power to public health agencies with arguably disastrous results. Our guest today, David Redman, argues that Canada's response to this pandemic has created massive collateral damage to Canadians and our society that will last probably a generation. Lieutenant Colonel David Redman has had a distinguished military career serving Canada on many missions abroad before becoming the head of Emergency Management Alberta in 2004. He led the provincial response to the devastating floods there of June 2005, and he's also led the development in 2005 and the development of Alberta's influenza plan. After retiring from emergency measures, he continued to work as an expert in emergency management provincially, nationally, and internationally. He fully retired in 2013 and is a policy fellow at Frontier, where his recent paper's analysis is featured on our center's website. A warm welcome to David Redman.
Thank you very much, David. This is going to be confusing. Two Davids.
Indeed, two Davids, and we're so delighted that you could join us here today. Now, David, you've been one of those extraordinary leaders in the midst of this crisis, carrying a very powerful message. Essentially, yes, this has been a pandemic that tragically has resulted in the death and illness of too many Canadians. But in addition, you said our country did not respond well, and that hurt even more people. Is that right?
In my opinion, the use of lockdowns never should have been contemplated for a pandemic of this nature. And in so doing, wave after wave after wave, it is my position that our premiers and our Prime Minister have created a situation of criminal negligence on their part.
That's a very serious charge to make, David. So we're going to go systematically through that case, and we're really curious what our audience has to say. But I did want to ask you a quick question. Do you remember the date, March 9, 2020?
Yes, I do.
What happened?
Well, in my opinion, the whole world became fixated on trying to understand what had happened around the world. And when you make a declaration of a pandemic, it's in no small measure a statement of perception. And so when we looked at what was happening in February and in March of 2020, the steps that should have been taken was to look at what this disease was actually doing. And we knew in both February and in March, from data coming out of China, coming out of Korea, coming out of the eastern countries around China, but in specifically coming out of Italy and Spain, that COVID-19 was particularly deadly to people over 60 with severe multiple comorbidities, and in fact, most over 75. 95% of the deaths in the middle of March were in that age category with severe comorbidities, what the British people call frail. People under the age of 60 were not seemingly at any more risk than from regular seasonal flu. And yet, when we declared the pandemic, there was no attempt to discriminate between the age groups that were being affected and what was happening. But we saw horrific pictures coming out of China of doors being welded shut, of people being locked in their houses, of emergency hospitals being constructed literally overnight. And that fear is what launched the Canadian response.
Now you say fear. You're a well-known leader in emergency management. Was fear inappropriate? Was that an inappropriate response?
In any emergency, in any situation where the public is involved, fear in a democracy is an unconscionable tool to use. It is not only wrong, simply because you don't ever want people to be afraid, but confidence in government is paramount in the middle of an emergency. I worked for premiers in the past, and I work for government officials worldwide. And the entire aim in a democracy is to ensure confidence in government. And you do that by writing a plan, presenting the plan to the public, showing how they can interact with the plan, how they can send feedback, and making sure they understand their role in the plan. But then you always try and put whatever the hazard is into perspective. Let's put COVID into perspective just for a moment. If you're between the ages of 20 and 40, you are 5 times more likely to be a traffic fatality in Canada than you are to die of COVID. And yet we keep telling our young people that they're equally at risk. For people under 20, it's even lower than that. For anyone under the age of 60, you are 1.5 times more likely to be a traffic fatality. And yet our medical officers of health are using fear to try and drive you into believing in lockdowns. And we'll talk about them in a minute, the efficacy of what a lockdown really is. But the use of fear is totally incorrect. Not just, we make fun of it when we see it in a dictatorship, but we didn't make fun of it when our premier and our prime minister used fear every single night and handed the reins of power to a medical officer of health who then used fear every night to try and get compliance. It's just the wrong thing to do in any kind of emergency.
Okay, so you're an emergency planner. You see the world partly through that methodology of bringing all the society elements together. And we had these plans in advance, right? We spent years of hard work, thousands of people's hours preparing for this. And we know that crises are not unusual. You went through many yourself in terms of floods, all kinds of natural disasters. So what happened was this, why would we take those carefully crafted plans and then just put them aside and give it to whom?
I believe what happened was the minute you placed the medical officer of health in charge, you put people in charge who, A, were never trained in emergency management, should never have been given the responsibility to coordinate that response. But the person who made that decision was the prime minister nationally and 13 premiers provincially and territorially. And that was the first wrong decision. Premiers, when they take office, are briefed on emergencies because it's the fundamental duty of a premier to keep their people of their province safe. So there's a briefing binder given to every premier on the day they're elected, and page 1 in it, and most of them, certainly in Alberta when I was the head of emergency management Alberta, was how to manage an emergency. And I just want to be on to the Frontier Center for Public Policy is my position paper on this. And it describes in detail, so I won't go into the microscopic detail of the steps that you follow, but it's a methodical process which can be done quickly or slowly depending on the time available. From February to March, we had 8 weeks to work our way through the process. And the first step is establishing the governance. And that's one of the most important pieces that I'd like to talk about today. The premier should have established a governance committee. They should not have handed it to the medical officer of health, who established a medical governance committee. I'll use the example of counterterrorism. On September the 12th, I was called September the 12th, 2011. I was summoned to a group which the Premier had assembled because of what had happened on September the 11th. And the Premier had established a governance committee. It was made up of 10 ministers. It was made up of their deputies, and it was made up of what I consider to be 26 of the brightest minds in the province of Alberta, many from the private sector, heads of massive corporations, but people who ran key industries.
So really
And
leaders across society, not
all
just
across
a
society,
couple.
and
Yeah.
with representation from the municipal order of government, and even members representing the opposition parties. So you had all orders of government, you had the public and private sector all in a room, and those were the people ultimately, by the end of the day, I had been assigned to become, and later became, the head of counterterrorism of the province of Alberta. But the process which I showed them was why I was assigned. I showed them that we were going to do the first step in the operational planning process called mission analysis, and I did it with that group of 26 incredibly bright people. So establishing the governance right at the very start of the pandemic, when we had 8 weeks watching it unfold around the world, should have included all the ministries that were going to be impacted by a pandemic. I would have said somewhere around 12. Instead, we had one, the Ministry of Health. And then they formed a group that was just purely doctors. It wasn't their fault that they missed everything, that they had been placed in charge, but it was their fault for not asking for the help that they should have asked for.
Okay, so I'm a lay person here. So in many ways, you're not against medical officers of health. You're for good emergency crisis management and planning in a way
Absolutely
that,
correct.
right. So it's
One
kind
of the people
holistic,
in that
right?
room would have been the medical officer of health, but they would have been one of a team of about 20 to 30 people covering things like the power grid, things like the water supply system, things like municipal order of government, who were constantly surprised by new health orders that emerged seemingly from nowhere to the mayors of our municipalities. You need everyone in the room. No one should ever be surprised in a pandemic. Nobody should be surprised in an emergency. Everyone should have helped write a plan. Let's go back to those plans that were sitting on the shelf here in Alberta, last updated 2014. They're on a 10-year cycle. It would have been updated in 2024. They contained all the hard lessons learned. And so I want to step back for a minute and talk about non-pharmaceutical interventions. I cover this in detail because a cost-benefit analysis is a key step in doing the full emergency management process. Non-pharmaceutical interventions are named in the 2014 plan, but there's 15 of them. We now call them lockdowns because collectively we seem to just decide to use them all at once. Never recommended. Out of the 15 non-pharmaceutical interventions, ones that we've come to know are closure of business, closure of schools, isolation of people that have been exposed. All 3 of those strongly recommended against in a pandemic of this nature. Why? Because it was known from previous pandemics that those measures have no significant impact on the spread of a viral disease of the nature of COVID.
But just hold on a sec. So you're saying that this had all been thought about years ago?
Yes.
These scenarios.
Last updated September 2019, right before this pandemic, but that wasn't the first edition of this work by the World Health Organization. The best infectious disease doctors in the world had produced this document repeatedly, about every 5 years, last updated immediately before this pandemic. And out of the 15, the ones we now call lockdowns, strongly recommended against for this type because they don't decrease the spread significantly. What they do is cause massive collateral damage. And in this 60-page document, each one of the 15 is discussed with the evidence, with the results, and with the recommendation based on the evidence from previous pandemics. Totally ignored.
Wow. So this is really kind of a shocker in the sense that we did all this planning, a very highly integrated kind of holistic approach, bringing key societal leaders together to handle any emergency, including a pandemic. It's all updated just prior to this. And then we promptly, what happened? We forgot about it?
You will have to ask the premiers because 13 out of 13 provinces had a pandemic influenza plan. That should have been the starting point. that plan then is taken because it's a generic plan. The first step you do is you look at the hazard and you see who's most at risk. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because that's the first thing we didn't do. You look at who's most at risk, you take your pre-existing plan and you tailor it for the specific disease, which has now become apparent. That gives you a good starting place to get that written plan out to the public quickly, but as well, that written plan then forms the minimum required of due diligence if you're even contemplating reducing any constitutional freedoms. You have to do a minimum test, like an Oakes test, to justify every single step that you're going to take that will limit a constitutional freedom, and that's never been done in any province in Canada.
Okay, so you're saying that if you're executing that emergency plan, it's a framework, a very important guide, because you put a lot of thought and effort into it. And part of that is doing trade-offs in any decision-making, including constitutional rights and freedoms. So what is an Oakes test? What is that, David?
Okay, the Oakes test was defined by in the courts for every time that you're contemplating going against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of our country and inhibiting. You are allowed, rights and freedoms aren't blanket. You don't just get them. They have to be put in place, and if you can demonstrably justify limiting a freedom for a specific period of time for a specific reason, the Oakes test is the test. You have to produce evidence and present it to the public why you are going to limit that freedom for a very short and specific period of time to overcome something. And you have to prove in the Oakes test that by limiting the freedom, you will do less damage than if the freedom was allowed to exist. It's very specific, and it outlays the type of evidence that's required. No provincial authority has ever attempted to demonstrably justify why massive constitutional freedoms have been inhibited. Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Wasn't everybody at risk? Wasn't this a pandemic, David? Didn't we need to protect everybody?
So let me step back again to the discussion point that I said I wanted to come back to. The first step in any emergency is you look at the hazard and you determine who's most at risk. You tailor your response to those who are most at risk. I said before, right at the start, that in the discussion, that in February 2020, we knew people over the age of 60, normally over the age of 70, with severe comorbidities were 95% of the deaths worldwide. To this day, 95% of the deaths worldwide, people over the age of 60, multiple severe comorbidities. And by severe comorbidity, I mean pre-existing heart conditions, pre-existing diabetes, severely treated, must be severely treated, cancers, dementia. Each of those comorbidities were known and stated in documents weekly by the World Health Organization against the number of deaths. So the first step we should have done was tailored our response to those most at risk, i.e. our seniors in Canada. Let me give you some stats. 95% of the deaths in Canada are in fact people over 60 with severe comorbidities. Average age of death in Canada is 84 with 2.8 comorbidities. These people were frail to start with, 84 years old, and yet we have the worst record in the Organization of Economically Developed Countries for protection of our seniors during this pandemic.
Sorry, Canada does?
Canada has the worst record in the OECD, Organization of Economically Developed Countries, in protection of our seniors. 73% of the deaths in Canada were in our seniors in long-term care homes. If we had established a safe and caring quarantine system, at least in the first wave, in our long-term care homes, immediately in March, we probably would have been able to avoid at least 50% of those deaths. Instead, we locked down our whole society with no demonstrable justification in the faint hope clause that it would protect our long-term care homes, which it obviously didn't. Out of the 26,000 deaths in Canada, 25,000 of them, more than 25,000 of them, are in our seniors, who we abandoned. And the Chief Medical Officer of Health of Canada even stated that 3 months ago. We abandoned our seniors, we failed them.
Well, so that's a very damning indictment. So Canada failed to protect, ironically, its most vulnerable citizens, namely seniors.
We did, and yet then we did worse. We didn't protect our seniors, and then by using lockdowns, which we knew would have massive collateral damage, we didn't do it once, we did it twice, we did it 3 times. And the massive collateral damage, the tip of the iceberg is starting to emerge. You're starting to see reports coming out, for instance, out of Stats Canada about the excess deaths in certain areas. Well, I can give you the certain areas: mental health, societal health, the destruction of the education of our youth, the other severe illnesses, things like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and our economy. And when people come after me and say, oh, you only care about money, you have to remember every bankruptcy is a family. Every bankruptcy is a group of people who just lost their income. But even more importantly, the national debt in Canada went from about $750 billion to $1.4 trillion in a year. And if people don't think that adding $500 billion to our federal debt alone, we'll talk about provincial debt, our federal debt alone, that immediately means, even at 1% interest, that there is $5 billion a year less than already was being spent to service the national debt, available for healthcare, available for social programs. That means that we're looking at smaller transfers from our federal government because we simply have to service $1.4 trillion of national debt, and they're not slowing down. But we spent that money to lock people in their homes from a disease which, if you're under the age of 60, you are 1.5 times more likely to be a traffic fatality than a COVID fatality. And that's why demonstrable justification, meeting the Oakes test, was never done and has cost us these huge collateral deaths: mental health, societal health, wow, education of our children. And we'll come back to children because that's unconscionable. Other severe diseases, and massive, massive impact on our economy and our citizens.
It is really something, David, because so often the overview of this crisis is so different than what we normally hear in the media. But you're not denying that this was a pandemic.
Absolutely not. We've seen worldwide that large number, there's a spike in deaths worldwide, but let's put it into perspective. And that's what medical officers of health are supposed to do, but have never done. Let's place a few things in perspective. Let's start by comparing this disease to other diseases. Every single year worldwide, 2.54 million people die from pneumonia. And I use pneumonia as an example because pneumonia and COVID-19 are very similar in how they attack your body and the types of things they do. In its first year, COVID killed 1.9 million people. 2.54 million people die every year from pneumonia. 1.9 million worldwide died from COVID. It will probably average out that pneumonia and COVID will be equal killers, probably about 2.5 million. We've never closed the entire world's economy for pneumonia. So if you compare apples to apples, you find that it's not that deadly. If you believe lockdowns have saved lives, then let's talk about Sweden, who is the great elephant in the room, so much so that the British tabloids turned it into a political cartoon, a giant elephant with a little Swedish flag. It's in my paper. I used it because there was only 2 options to Boris Johnson: lockdown or lockdown harder. If you look at what they did in Sweden, they did not lock down. They kept their schools open. They strongly recommended against wearing masks. They never ordered any businesses closed. The Swedish society has carried on to this day. They've been berated by the world press because they have a higher death rate in Finland than Finland and Norway. What they never say is they have a lower death rate than the huge lockdown countries of the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Poland. The huge lockdown countries have a higher mortality rate than Sweden. But what Sweden doesn't have, if you only want to count COVID deaths, that's one thing, but let's count the collateral deaths. What Sweden doesn't have is they don't have mental health issues. They don't have societal health issues. They haven't destroyed their children's education. They never closed their schools. Their other severe diseases continue to be treated regularly in their hospitals, and they have the lowest drop in GDP of all the European countries.
Wow. So you see Sweden as a really significant example that we should have followed. Did they follow an emergency management approach?
They followed the exact approach that we had written into our plans and that we should have followed. And yet the world press said, Sweden's dangerous experiment. The experiment was lockdowns, and the lockdown experiment failed. How they approached it and the way they unrolled their emergency management process in Sweden is exactly what was written into our plan.
So we want to clarify this. So Sweden did the emergency planning for years, and that's exactly what they did. It wasn't an experiment. It wasn't anything new. They followed the plan, but we didn't.
We didn't. And that's province after province, right? If you go to pandemicalternative.org, you can find nicely collected all 13 provincial plans and the federal plan. They're in the papers there. We all had them. We just ignored them and placed the medical officers of the health in charge, who were not trained to do this, but unconscionable that a doctor, a medical officer of health, would do two things in their oath: do no harm, and you have to justify every treatment before you do it. Well, the treatment of lockdown for a whole society, they needed to prove in a cost-benefit analysis that it would do less harm than good and advise the patient, i.e. the province.
Wow.
Never done.
So what a tragic situation. We had this pandemic come along, I'm paraphrasing, and our response made it really, really bad.
Our response, there's been repeated studies done worldwide, but two of particular note right here in Canada by Canadians. Dr. Ari Jaffe in Alberta, in fact, he's an infectious disease specialist here in Alberta, wrote a paper that said at least 10 times more harm, and he was very specific, at least 10 times more harm is being done by lockdowns than by the disease. Even more damning is a paper out of Simon Fraser University by Professor Douglas Allen, who did a massive study worldwide and specifically to Canada, where he concludes that somewhere between 2 and 200 times more damage, and he settles around 80 to 100 times more damage being done by lockdowns than by the disease itself.
Wow.
And as we talked earlier, we're just seeing the tip of that iceberg coming out. Each of those collateral damages will start now, but they're going to last at least a decade. And I'd like to go back to children if I could. It's been shown, study after study, that inhibiting education in children has a very serious current and long-term effect. Current because their socialization has been totally interrupted, their fear of each other has been built. And it's unconscionable that we would do that to our children.
Mm-hmm.
But more so, every interrupted year of education diminishes lifespan of those children, diminishes their capacity to have gainful employment throughout their life. There's many scientific studies that prove it. And yet we didn't just do it for 1 year, we did it for 2 years with children whose risk of dying from COVID is significantly less than seasonal influenza.
Wow.
We never do it for the flu. Why did we do it for COVID?
So David,
and now we're still hearing discussions about masking our children or limiting their school next year.
Right. No, the impacts are almost hard to fathom, aren't they? You know, it's interesting. You have quite a story even about your own grandchildren, about a call about their school being locked down.
Well, I want to do two pieces there. First of all, back in September, the medical officers of health switched gears because they were afraid that people weren't being compliant enough with their, in my opinion, illegal lockdowns. And so they started a new fear campaign. And the campaign of fear was they had teachers telling students every day in class that if they didn't take the appropriate action and stay within their own household communities, they could kill their grandparents.
Sorry,
that
this was
fear
messaging?
driven into school-age children from grades 1 through 12. My grandchildren are in their teens. They're all in high school now. junior high last year. And they were coming home saying, Grandpa, are you sure you want to get together for Sunday dinner? Because we might kill you. I couldn't believe it. I simply couldn't believe it. That our government would use terror in our children. But let's talk about here in Alberta. They say, well, our restrictions have been much more moderate than other provinces. Every province has done their own thing, which is, again, something we should talk about. Mutual aid doesn't come out of going your own way. It comes by working together. But here in Alberta, they said, well, we've only locked down our schools for shorter periods of time, not completely. Well, first of all, one of my granddaughters, supposedly in a non-lockdown school, every time someone in a family group would test positive for COVID, complete cohorts were sent home of 80 children, anyone in the cohort of that family member. That happened 4 times for two weeks per time, plus the lockdowns over Christmas, plus the lockdowns in March, so 2 years have been completely lost. So anyone that says school children haven't been affected, it's a complete lie. Going from online learning, which we know is far less effective than in-school learning for children under the age of 18, and having these constant interruptions with constant messaging of fear has had a huge impact that will last this group of children's complete lifespan. Wow. They will have a different perspective on democracy and on their government and on the fear of diseases and how to respond for their whole lives.
Okay, so when we look at your earlier point, so we didn't take an emergency planning approach that we'd carefully put together. We somehow put that aside. We also didn't protect the most vulnerable at risk, namely an older population with comorbidities or health challenges. How could we have possibly protected the seniors? I know it's hindsight is 2020, but
well,
again, we've gone through this before.
Let's talk about what a quarantine actually is. And we saw medical officers of health that seemed to be absolutely baffled by the concept when they said that they were going to take measures like they were going to stop healthcare workers working at more than one long-term care home. That was going to solve the problem. A quarantine is a quarantine. What you do is you take the long-term care homes, and there's 2,013 of them in Canada total. You take a long-term care home and you quarantine the staff and the residents. And when I say that, you do it in a caring and a compassionate manner. You don't do what we've done in many of our long-term care homes. You don't lock the patients in their room or the residents in their room. You treat it as if it's totally normal inside that bubble. They can go where they want. They can meet with their friends. They can have discussions. The staff, it's quarantined as well. So government provided facility in a quarantine center, very close to the long-term care center, quarantine staff that drive them back and forth, and they can work in as many long-term care homes as they want, as long as they stay in the quarantine. I use what I call the Fort McMurray model, which is what we thought of first way back, sitting over a bottle of scotch in early March with my son, was how we treat workers in Fort McMurray. 30 days in a long-term home care center, 16 days full paid holidays with your family, 14 days back into a pre-quarantine center to move back in for your next 30-day shift. You pay appropriately, and you would have found, I'm pretty sure, that people were extremely willing to do it. I give an example in my paper of France. There was a long-term care facility in France, in the epicenter of the outbreak in France. And the staff themselves said, we're not going to kill our patients. And they voluntarily locked themselves in their long-term care home for 47 days. Not a single person died. But you do it in a caring, compassionate manner. If you've got that model, you can offer that type of a quarantine system to our seniors that are still out in society. 73% died in long-term care homes, but that means others of our seniors could have been offered this protection if they didn't want to stay with their family groups out in society. But as well, you bring entertainers into that bubble, and they can go to the long-term care homes, provide entertainment, they can do games, they can do whatever. You provide additional support in terms of social media for the seniors with support staff to help them use it. And you make sure that family members who are willing to do the 14-day quarantine and a 30-day cycle are given that option as well.
So we could
None of this even discussed by our medical officers of health.
Wow. So we could have done the quarantine, as you say, that was specific, not this general lockdown.
Correct. And as time goes on, we should have right at the start put a focus on rapid testing. And then you don't even have to remove the staff from their homes. You have surge capacity, and the staff is tested before they start their shift in the morning. And if the test is only good for 4 hours, they test again at lunch.
Mhm.
But if it's good for the whole day, and then they go home at night. And if when they
Okay.
walk in the door, they test positive, they're sent home. And the additional surge you've got carries on for that day. By the second wave, we could have had many solutions. We chose not to even consider them. In the second wave, our long-term care home deaths were just as deadly as in our first wave. And in the third wave, it only went down because of vaccines. So we never once considered the quarantining of the staff.
Okay. So the general lockdown, the big response that the medical officers of health really led on in our country, did they work?
Obviously not. And let me be very definitive. I can give you, and it's in my paper, 35 peer-reviewed studies done by the best infectious disease doctors in the world who have studied non-lockdown to lockdown countries. And believe it or not, there's many who chose not to follow the lockdown path. States in the US, countries in the world. If you compare them by geographic zone, so same climate, same rural-urban mix, they were meticulous in comparing apples with apples, not comparing Australia with friggin' Russia. I mean, same climate, same. The studies reproved what we already knew from the WHO 2019 document, that non-pharmaceutical interventions do not have a significant impact on the spread of disease.
Okay. So you have massive amount of research has been done on this that shows that lockdowns are not effective, the larger lockdowns, but it's the non-pharmaceutical interventions. And what do you mean by that? Do you mean like washing your hands?
Non-pharmaceutical interventions, there are in fact 15 of them. And in the WHO document, they're all listed. It's in my paper. I go through this in great detail in an annex. So the 15 non-pharmaceutical interventions are hand hygiene, respiratory etiquette, face masks for symptomatic individuals, heavy emphasis on symptomatic, surface and object cleaning, increased ventilation, isolation of sick individuals, travel advice, use of UV light, modifying humidity, contact tracing, quarantine of exposed individuals, entry and exit borders, and border closures. So let me read to you, right? This is the summary on the front. Not recommended in any circumstances for any pandemic. This is the 2019 document. UV light, modifying humidity, contact tracing, not recommended in any pandemic. Quarantine of exposed individuals, not of sick individuals, of exposed individuals. This quarantining of exposed individuals has no significant impact on the spread of the disease.
Wow.
Entry and exit screening and border closures, not recommended in any pandemic. And yet the fear factor cranked up by our elected officials, premiers and prime minister, and our medical officers of health, we've seen every one of those used. But let's talk about things like school closures and workplace closures. Workplace closures. Let me just grab the right piece of paper. Workplace closures should be a last step, only considered in extraordinarily severe endemics and pandemics. And yet it was used as the first response in March of 2020.
Wow.
Exactly the same recommendation for school closures. Why? Because they have very little to no effect on transmission of the disease, but they have massive collateral damage.
You know, David, I just marvel at how many things you've listed there. The messaging we get from the media is just the opposite. What the heck is going on here? It's almost like we've taken the careful practice book that we've worked out for years and we've collaborated on, and then we threw it out the window.
Fear is a horrible thing. We, the public, watched fear coming out of China. Then they watched it in Italy with the dead bodies in the streets and in Spain, but nobody then started to qualify and put into perspective what they were seeing. The media was allowed to run amok, and I don't blame the media, they sell copy. I blame the medical officers of health for not saying immediately, this disease is targeting specific age groups. We are now going to target protection for those age groups, and this is how we're going to do it. Plunk, plunk, plunk. It is not deadly to others. So instead of the fear campaign, you'll kill your grandparents, you all have to lock down in your family groups and stay in your houses. We should have been saying, you know, you're more at risk from the car you drive, and yet we're not taking your car away. You're more at risk from heart disease every single day. You know the best way to fight off COVID? Stay healthy. How do you stay healthy? We should have had a big a big push for 2 years looking at the health of Canadians and recommendations for how you could make yourself healthier, because if you're healthy, the chance of COVID taking your life is very slim to nil.
Wow.
And yet we saw targeted fear campaigns here in Alberta. The Edmonton Medical Staff Advisory Association is still on the TV every night, given media time to present what might happen and the great concern about our unvaccinated children under the age of 12 and the horrible impacts that COVID might have, and these new deadly variants, which the countries that already have them, they're not proving to be any more deadly variant.
So we're going through the Greek alphabet here. We've got the Delta variant, we've got the Lambda. I'm sure there's going to be others. Are those of major concern? What's the data show on the mortality around those?
Let's be clear. There's over 3,000 variants.
3,000.
The ones you hear about, there's the variants of under observation and the variants of concern, and they keep pulling a new one out of the hat because they seem to be more contagious. Well, when they use the word that, for instance, Delta spreads twice as fast as the other, well, it was only spreading at a certain rate and spreading at twice that rate. But if you focus your response on case count, you are administering a pandemic in exactly the wrong manner. You base it on outcomes. The people who are dying are our seniors over the age of 60 with severe multiple comorbidities. Others aren't. If you look at Sweden, without any of those restrictions, and in the first year, 136 people died under the age of 60 in Sweden. So if lockdowns are the only way to save lives, why is it that Sweden has 3 times that many dying car fatalities? And in fact, under the age of 60 and under the age of 50, the Canadian and Swedish numbers are almost identical on a per capita basis, simply because this disease, the people who are under 60 who are dying of COVID, only 2.8% of all the deaths in Canada didn't have a predefined severe comorbidity. So we're calling them COVID deaths, but they were on top of a severe comorbidity that already existed. And again, that narrative is never presented to you by the medical officers of health in those nightly terror campaigns.
Now, so in many ways going forward now, we've got still a lot of concern, fear going forward. What should we be doing, David, and how do we get back to these plans and that should really be the framework for our response?
I have trying to get any one premier to actually go back to their pre-existing plan. I've tried this now by direct contact with the premier's offices every single month for the whole year. Obviously, my impact was zero, right? So I understood that route's not doing it. I tried to do it through public information sessions. And well, that had some effect here in Alberta particularly, but in other places, not so much. I've come to the realization that the only way the Canadian public will get back the life they had is by proving to the Canadian public that what we did wasn't just wrong, it was criminally wrong. And that's why I wrote the paper that's now on Frontier Centre for Public Policy. I call it Canada's Deadly Response to COVID-19. But in it, I go step by step to prove why our premiers and medical officer of health and our prime minister aren't grossly negligent, they're criminally negligent. For the public to 70% of the Canadian public still thinks we're unlocking too fast. We should never have locked down, period. Unlocking too fast, we should open our doors and get back to work, because we now have to pay off $500 billion of debt in order just to get back to where we were. The impact on mental health, there's got to be a provincial plan in 13 out of 13 provinces and territories to overcome the mental health, the complete breakdown of societal health, to overcome the destruction of a full generation's education, to make up for all of those deadly diseases that have gone undiagnosed and untreated, and to overcome that financial burden. The only way, in my opinion, to do that is to hold our premiers and medical officers accountable in court. Because until they are, the Canadian public will continue to believe that lockdowns are effective and that lockdowns were the only way we could possibly have gotten through this pandemic.
Do you think that will happen potentially, as some of these decision makers will be held to account and, say, go to jail?
Absolutely not. I wrote the paper on the full understanding that I'm a realist, and I don't think that it will ever go that way. Why? Because I don't think there's any judge in Canada that's willing to throw a premier and an MOH in jail, because then the lawsuits for criminal deaths in all of those comorbidities will overwhelm our Canadian society. So there'll be some way, but the mere fact that it goes in every province, people bringing these people, these elected officials and our MOH to court, will force mainstream media to finally open their doors and have a discussion, which has not been permitted. There's been complete censorship on people like me, and on people like Dr. Jaffe, and on people like Professor Douglas Allen. Anyone who says anything that says lockdowns don't work, and yet they cause massive collateral damage, and we abandoned our seniors by using lockdowns instead of targeted protection, we are completely censored.
And why is that? What is your theory on that?
My theory is obvious. The medical officers of health were given power and control, and the only way to get people to follow the medical rules and the medical orders was to use the fear. The fear gets broken when people realize that we lose more people to pneumonia every year than we lose to COVID. It's broken when people start to understand that just driving to work, they're 5 times more likely to die than to catch and die of COVID. It all falls apart when you put it in perspective. And let's talk about overwhelming the medical system. The one thing you're never given by a medical officer of health is a denominator. And what do I mean by that? Let's look at Ontario. At its peak, the Premier of Ontario, almost in tears, went on the television saying there's 1,760 patients in acute care beds with COVID. People, you're not following the lockdown rules, which we know had no effect, but he thought they did. You are not doing your part. There are 1,760 people in acute care beds. Do you know there are 22,358 acute care beds in Ontario? 1,760 with COVID patients, 22,358 available beds. Not available with other patients. It wasn't COVID overwhelming the medical system. I can use the example in Alberta. At peak, 900 people in acute care beds. Again, presented as if the hospital system was about to implode. Well over 9,000 acute care beds in Alberta. COVID wasn't overwhelming. It was contributing to, but it wasn't the main factor and if we had developed real surge capability, and by that I mean in people and infrastructure, equipment and supplies, at the very start of this pandemic, focusing on clean versus dirty hospitals, establishing a correct medical system, we never would have had the discussion about overwhelming our hospital systems and performing triage on who's going to live and die in the hallways. Another fear tactic, right? Completely ridiculous.
David, can you talk a little bit about the fear and the impact on, really, in many ways, our democratic system, our trust in government? And I think that would be another major casualty. And how do we restore that trust? That's one of the questions from our audience. How do we restore the public's trust again in really major decisions that I think many people intuitively wonder whether they were even correct?
And And so I start with the premise that they were totally incorrect. How do you create confidence in government? I wrote it in the paper, but you start by writing a plan with the entire governance team, with every person who's going to be affected by the pandemic, which in a pandemic is everyone. So you need input, all orders of government, private and public sector. You need to produce that plan and issue it. And you issue it in a way through the media, which then kills the media's ability to go down the fear trail, right? Here's the plan. Here's what we're going to do. People can shoot at the plan, but that's good, because in the middle of an emergency, you want every mind bringing solutions to the table. You don't want to cut the public out of the discussion. You want them in the discussion, and right in the plan, you tell them how to participate in the plan and how to give feedback, right? You include everyone, therefore everyone feels part of the solution. The next step is you put a very clear focus on those most at risk, and you display that to the public. You say, here's the people most at risk, our seniors. And look what we're going to do. We're going to quarantine these centers, but we're going to do it in a fun and friendly and positive manner. So you don't have to worry about them. We're taking care of them. Confidence in government. You get on with your lives. You get on with your lives. Why? Because here's COVID in relation to you. And here's what you, as a citizen, can do. If you're between the age of 20 and 40, here's its risk. And here's how to keep yourself healthy. If you're in that group that's 50 to 60, you're on the cusp. So here's some specific health advice for you. You target health advice by age group. For children, you say to parents, your children aren't at risk. Yes, there will be some who die, but they're going to be such a tiny portion. But what you can't do is say it once and walk away.
Okay,
because if you leave an information void, it will get filled. It'll get filled by the Twitter crowd. It'll get filled by the media. You have to go out every single night, like the medical officers of health did with a terror campaign, only it's got to be the premier with a confidence in government campaign with real facts, real data. As the numbers emerge worldwide, they say, see, we told you. Worldwide, 95% of the deaths are in seniors, but here in Canada, it's less because of what we're doing. We're doing the right thing.
I want to explore with you a little bit further then, David, what really happened with the putting aside of these emergency plans? You didn't really see the premiers out as front as the medical officers of health. What happened to those plans? Why were the premiers not really at the forefront of the issue?
Again, they should be demanded to say why in court, because I can't figure out why they didn't follow the very plans that they knew existed. And that to me is due diligence. You either knew or should have known. Well, there's a pandemic influenza plan in every province and territory in Canada. They definitely should have known. So why did they ignore those plans? Why did they put the medical officer of health in charge? They should be called to court to say why they did that. Because I wrote to them saying, you're doing the wrong thing. And I've got the emails and I've got the answers back saying, thank you very much. We're sending your information to the Minister of Health. And I wrote immediately back saying, don't do that. This is for the Premier. And I need a conversation with the Premier. I don't want a job. I just want him to use the staff he's already got and the plan he's got, tailor it, focus it for COVID. So why didn't they? I think this wall of fear that came out of Italy and Spain, it swept across our country, and it was almost like one-upmanship. If Ontario closed their school for 2 weeks, in Alberta, we closed them till September. If one province locked down a certain industry, we locked down 4, right? As it tumbled across our country, everyone trying to outdo each other in being super efficient on lockdowns when it was exactly the wrong thing to do. And why did we follow the lockdown path? Because our medical officers of health were placed in charge and they had no other concept other than what they'd seen happen in Europe and in China. And instead of bringing that full team together under a governance model and developing all of the options, doing a cost benefit analysis and going, holy crap, lockdowns are going to kill people way more than they'll save. Because they never did that cost benefit analysis, in their narrow medical tube, the only thing that counted was 2 things. Number 1, protection of the medical system. And number 2, only a COVID death was a real death. To the medical officers of health, that was their entire focus. totally the wrong focus. The aim in a pandemic, let's say I'll talk about Saskatchewan. The Premier of Saskatchewan's aim should have been to minimize the impact of COVID-19 on Saskatchewan. Instead, the aim was to minimize the number of people in Saskatchewan who catch COVID.
Wow.
Totally
Well,
different aim.
I want to just turn to our audience. If you have questions for Mr. Redman, please do pose them. We've carried a number of questions from the audience, but we certainly welcome them through our chat. But what strikes me about this, David, as well, is the amount of time and effort you have as a professional who has great experience in this area. The amount of time and effort you've put into this, communicating this message is so timely. Why do you do this? Why do you actually care?
I had wonderful opportunities in my life. In my 27 years in the Army, I lived we were posted 19 times in 27 years. We moved almost every summer. And so my children grew up as gypsies. But that gave them and my wife and I the opportunity to see many different cultures in many parts of the world. Two things were driven home to all 5 members of my family. My children constantly said it. Number one, they couldn't wait to get back to Canada. All the places were fun. They were exciting. We had a great time, but Canada was different. It was special. And because of some of the places I went without my family, you can understand where those places were. I also got to see when people were forced not to live with freedom and democracy. And those two impacts on my life taught me to never take for granted my country and never to take for granted my Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I want to step you back to September the 11th. When September the 11th, 2001 happened, I watched those towers come down with everybody else, and I knew the world had changed forever in some way or another. September the 12th, the very next morning, I get called at 7 o'clock in the morning to get my ass over to this group of very smart people. And I was called as a plans writer to sit in the back of the room and keep my mouth shut and listen to what the smart people said, and then to go to the leader of the group, the head of the governance task force. After 2 hours, I said, folks, if you can give me 20 minutes, I will show you a process, which we use in every emergency. And I'll show you, if you give me 20 minutes, I will make the blackboards so that you can understand what I'm saying. After a 20-minute break and then a 20-minute presentation on how emergency management works, the entire room then decided that that's what we would do. And that's what should have happened here. But my point of this is, if we give up our Charter rights and freedoms, my aim for 2 months, actually writing the counterterrorism plan and then starting to implement it, was to never deny a charter right or a freedom that I couldn't fully justify. And I didn't even know about the Oakes test in those days. In my mind, it was unconscionable that a terrorist would take away my rights and freedoms, period. Let's think about this pandemic. It doesn't matter whether one of the terrorist attacks that we built the plan to handle was an intentional release of a virus. So what's the difference between an intentional release of a virus and an accidental release of a virus to an emergency manager? Zero. To the director of counterterrorism, I had the job to go find those people before they released it and neutralize them. But in emergency management, once it was released, it didn't matter how it got released. The response was the same. You used the same process. You took the pandemic influenza plan, you tailored it for the disease, you issued it to the public, you stopped fear by every night telling people why they shouldn't be afraid, as opposed to what we've done, which is why they should. So to me, my life and my background taught me and my children that, number one, Canada is a special place. And number two, you never give up your charter rights and freedoms, because we saw many countries where they didn't exist and you didn't want to live there.
What a powerful story, David. And on that note, I have a question from the audience, and that is, will the premiers and the medical officers of health actually have to answer why they promoted lockdowns in court? Is that underway? Is there any possibility that that process may happen?
There are already some court cases, but I put it to you that civil court cases, the Crown doesn't have to display all their evidence. In a criminal case, the Crown is obligated to present every piece of evidence that they believe is relevant or might be relevant. What we're looking for them to prove is that they ever did a cost-benefit analysis of lockdown versus non-lockdown, because without that, they could never demonstrably justify a single one of the public health orders that denied charter rights and freedoms. As well, for a doctor to do more harm than good without demonstrable justification and a fully informed public, they should have their license to practice medicine revoked. So I believe that's the only method left, because trying to get out through the mainstream media is impossible. We're censored. I believe that the alternative media has done what it can do, but I believe that if we can actually get, and for the cases to happen, I've been asked this very specifically. How does a case happen? Well, first of all, you need a very large and well-funded law firm that understands how to bring charges, criminal charges, against government officials. They need a track history, but they need to be a large law firm, because the government is going to roll every lawyer they've got, and they've got hundreds. Number two, you need a class action suit. You need mental health, societal health, other severe illnesses, people who've died. You need the families of the people impacted. The destruction of our children's education, bankrupt industry. To build a class action suit, which then those lawyers are going to take for the deaths and damage caused by lockdowns, to force the government to justify why. So first, you need a big law firm. Second, you need a class action group. Third, you need a group of experts. So you need medical experts, people like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, Dr. Ari Jaffe, people like Professor Allen, each with their own specialty to provide to that team. And then you're going to need someone with serious pockets in order to sustain this, because this isn't a one-day in court thing. This is probably 10 years. But that 10 years is not spent with the hope of ever getting one of them in jail, which is where they should be. It's with the hope of intentionally educating the public through mainstream media.
All right. So there may be windows that emerge over time, and certainly the class action lawsuit is not uncommon. So let's wait and see. And I know that there are groups certainly looking at this. As we look at the teams of people working at this issue, along with yourself, David, I know that Frontier, we're honored to be able to work with you and help promote your efforts in terms of the paper, which is on the website. I also wanted to highlight to our audience Frontier's book, COVID-19, The Politics of a Pandemic Moral Panic, by Dr. Barry Cooper and Marco Navarro. I think that book explores well the political and social responses that contributed to almost this distorted, almost simplified and exaggerated response to COVID-19. So I think that's a very important part of underlining the kind of thesis that you've developed today and shared with us.
I've quoted that book by Marco and Barry in my paper for the simple reason that they nicely encapsulated the first wave and all of the evidence against the use of lockdowns, and they did it professionally and in a very easy to read manner. I really recommend people read that, and then carry that thought process to the second wave, and then unconscionably to the third wave, because they've described it extremely well.
So David, as we look to wrap up here, can you summarize again one of the key actions that audience members should do about this, other than say reading your paper and that book and being aware of a variety of perspectives and analyses about this issue? What should we be doing?
Folks, there's only one person in each province and territory in Canada who can change what we've done going forward and who can make sure it doesn't happen again, and that's a premier. For our country, it's our Prime Minister, who has blown $500 billion out the door supporting lockdowns. The only way you can change and make sure this never happens again is by going through your MLA and threatening the next election for your premier. You need to call your premier's office. Don't email them, don't send them a letter. They'll ignore you just like they did me. But if the public at large phones the Premier's offices every single day until you hear your Premier admit on national television that they're going to re-examine how they did this before October 15th, folks, we'll be back here on October 15th. But you need to hound, by the use of your telephone, every Premier in our provinces and territories and the Prime Minister, and constantly show that you understand what we did is wrong. And to do that, I would hope you would read the paper that's on Frontier Center for Public Policy, simply to give yourself the ammunition you need to fight any stupid response that you're going to get, and you'll get a lot of stupid responses.
All right, so that's a call to action on behalf of all of us, and we certainly want to thank you, David, and thank everyone who's joined us. COVID-19 has been a pandemic, and it's been hard on almost everyone. And it's been hard on everyone also because of the response that was undertaken by government. And now, as we look to the future, I'm grateful that we can have this discussion, that we have the freedom to do so, and we certainly cannot take that for granted. And that is for the sake of all Canadians, especially as we look around the corner. And on that note, I want to thank everyone for joining our discussion, and a special thank you to you, David Redman. You certainly have done incredible work on behalf of all of us at Frontier, but also, dare I say, on behalf of all Canadians. So thank you so much, David.
Thanks, David.
So thank you to all the Friends of Frontier who donate to make our center possible. We're very grateful for your generous support. Frontier does not accept any government funding, so any way you can support our mission is very much appreciated. We can do better at responding, and so thank you again to David Redman and your thoughts, and all of you for joining us. And thank you again. Until next time, we wish you all the very best to you and your family.